I met this girl when I was 10 years old. And what I love most, she has so much soul. Hey everybody, it's Old School Heart back with another review for you guys. So this review is going to be on Netflix's documentary Crack, Cocaine, and Conspiracy, directed by Stanley Nelson Jr. So, some quick facts about Stanley Nelson Jr. Stanley Nelson Jr. was born in New York. His mother actually was the last presiding president for the Madam C.J. Walker Corporation before it ended. His father was a dentist in New York as well. So Nelson grew up with a lot of culture, forwarding culture, Black culture. And from there was able to successfully move on as a documentary director. So one of the fascinating things that I learned about Stanley Nelson Jr. is that he's like one of my favorite documentary directors. Who would have thought, right? I did not know that he produced some of the documentaries that I have obsessively watched. One of them being The Murder of Emmit Till. I found that in college years ago, fell in love with it. I still watch it from time to time. That was one of my favorite documentaries. Also, Jonestown, The Life and Death of the People's Temple. A lot of people don't know this, but I'm a big researcher of cults. And one of the ones that I am obsessed with is Jonestown, Jim Jones, the Kool-Aid, the whole thing. Fascinated with that cult. And last but certainly not least is Freedom Riders. I loved Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders appeared on PBS. You can still watch it actually on Amazon. Hopefully Amazon, hopefully PBS did not take off all of their stuff, but they have been moving their stuff over to their own app. But Freedom Riders, such a good documentary from beginning to end. I have watched that obsessively. So that is a little bit of facts on Stanley Nelson Jr. that you may not know. So I don't have to tell you that there are spoiler alerts. So if you have not watched Crack, Cocaine, and Conspiracy on Netflix, go back, watch the documentary a couple of times, and then come back and look at the review. So this documentary is split into 6 chapters. The first one is Greed is Good. The second one is They Call It Crack. The third one is Street Capitalist. The fourth is The Virus. The fifth is Just Say No Reagan. And then it ends with chapter 6, Media Frenzy. Okay, so chapter 1 is Greed is Good. And this is where Stanley Nelson Jr. talks about how the rise of Reagan also is the demise of the African-American progression, right? So what we see in the first part of this documentary is, you know, Reagan promising people that the economy will be boosted. And so you see a lot of people, white people, basically become rich. And you see Black Americans start to decline economically due to cuts in some of the social programs that were helping us move forward. So we have Reagan who comes in, he cuts food stamps, he cuts housing, and he has this idea that, you know, the way that you progress in America is basically by pulling yourself up by the bootstrap. And we know Republicans are synonymous with that saying, right? Pulling yourself up by your bootstrap, helping your own self, putting your own self on. That is something that they acknowledge widely as a political group. You know, so during this time, especially in 1982, we have the highest unemployment rate. You know, Blacks are really, really suffering while whites are moving upward and onward through the Reagan administration. Now, as white America progressive economically, this is when we see cocaine enter the scene, right? So cocaine ends up coming in those white suburban affluent areas, right? You see them in Hollywood, you see them around actors and musicians and different things like that, people who could afford cocaine. So as we see cocaine move around these white affluent neighborhoods and Hollywood and through musicians and through film, you know, we see an increase in the desire to have cocaine, and also we see an increase in addiction. So, you know, as reported in the documentary, they say 63 tons of cocaine move throughout the United States at this time. So there is a higher demand for it. People are getting addicted to it. So then we move on to chapter 2, which is, they call it crack. And this is where they discuss the moving of cocaine, which is primarily found in white affluent neighborhoods in the Hollywood scene and movies and etc., to the lower quality version of crack. And we all know that crack is widely distributed in the Black community. It's cheap, it's easy to get, and it's just as addicting as cocaine. And so one of the things that I found really fascinating about this particular chapter in the documentary is something one of the guests or one of the people on the documentary said, and I want to quote him really quickly. He said, "I don't think we understand the trauma of poverty. And I think in a way, any method we can employ to escape the fact that we are Black and oppressed, we will." So we know that during this time that Reagan has basically shitted on us. You know, we have very low means to support ourselves. Black men have been taken outside of the household in order that the Black female and their children are taken care of. And so there's a lot of pressure on the Black community at this time to take care of themselves. And so they call it crack, deals with the addiction that the drug brings in. And the addiction is so strong that certain things began to happen in the Black community. We see Black mothers who unfortunately, you know, aren't able to take care of their kids because the addiction is so high. We see the same thing with Black males. We see a lot of robbing. We see a lot of stealing. We see a lot of things in the Black community that had never been a problem before. Then we go on to chapter 3, which talks about street capitalists, right? So that's where Stanley Nelson Jr. introduces all of these people who were able to climb the economic ladder financially through the selling of crack to our community. So he interviews people like Freeway Rick Ross, which, you know, he is synonymous with the ultimate dealer, right? There has been stories on him, documentaries on him. He's using music quite a bit. And so there are a number of men who talk about their experiences as young Black males who were able to take advantage of how easy it was to get crack and how easy it was to also sell it. So you have Freeway Rick Ross talking about, you know, $1 million has touched his hands in one day. You know, how he owned laundromats, bars, beauty salons and gas stations and different things like that, all from selling crack. You know, one of the things that comes with being street capitalist comes this need to never enter poverty again. And so you see a lot of crack dealers began to be very, very territorial, because one of the things that happens when there is a lot of money that comes into the community, right? And there is someone who's able to make the money, they become territorial with how they keep it. And so this is where you see sets come in. This is where you see people who probably were never very threatening start to be very protective of their money and very protective of the community in which they receive their money. And so you see a lot of violence start to occur in the Black community, because you have dealers who don't want other dealers in their community selling, right? Because that takes away from them. So you see a lot of people dying in the streets. You see a lot of drive-bys and robbing and stealing and things in our community that we can say were a problem before, but not to the height that it has become. And at the same time, you see police and different things like that pretty much turn a blind eye because, you know, the whole perspective at this time was they're killing themselves, they're not bothering anybody else, and we are not going to pay attention to it at all. And so Street Capitalist basically just talks about each drug dealer's experience in the game. So the next chapter is chapter 4, and it deals with the virus. And so this is one of the most serious parts of the documentary to me. And I think this is where Stanley Nelson Jr. does an absolutely good job in basically conveying how serious crack had become. You know, at first crack was considered pretty much like a party drug, right? You know, you did it to enjoy your day, but you know, shit started to hit the fan. So you have street capitalists running the streets, right? You know, they're distributing all this crack, they're making money, there's more violence, there's more deaths, you know, there's a lot going on. And simultaneously, you have more and more Black people becoming addicted to crack, right? You have more and more people who aren't able to maintain their own households because of crack, you know. And one of the things that stood out to me about this particular part was just how much, you know, crack had hurt the Black woman in particular. And this was one of the parts of the documentary that affected me the most, especially when they got into the song about your mama's on crack rock. You know, when that song came out, I might have been like 8. I recall that song being a song we use even as kids to be mean to other children, right? You know, that song was used to bully. That song was used to humiliate. And, you know, I even participated in singing that song and harassing other kids with that song. And the one thing that really, really frustrates me is how we even let a song like that come out. Looking back on it, even though I was a small child and unbeknownst to me, not understanding that crack is an addiction and it stems from many things. And we know now that, you know, 89% of the music industry is controlled by white people. And the fact that that song was distributed and played around the United States is so telling to me. It's hurtful. And, you know, looking at my own experience, you know, with my own family members, just being very, very critical of them, being very angry and dismissive towards them because of, you know, what I saw in the media and how, you know, we treated these type of people. And the part that sucked about this part in particular was how, you know, one of the commentators on the documentary, I don't know if he was uneasy and so he was smiling because he was uneasy, but one of the things that struck me about his particular interview was when they were talking about, you know, how some women used sex as a means to receive crack, right? And how, you know, he knew, you know, certain men who had, you know, rooms or, you know, cars in which sexual transactions could, you know, be used in order to you know, have a trade for the crack, right? So sex could be used for crack. One of the things that was just uneasy about watching that was, you know, him smiling about it and saying, yeah, I knew, you know, a couple of guys, you know, who used to do stuff like that. And I was like, it was wild, you know. And another guy admitted that, you know, even he had also participated in receiving sex as a form of payment for crack. You know, one of the things that I will say is, even though we did not understand just how significant crack was to the community and how much of an addiction it was, you know, we do have to take some accountability, especially Black men. They really do have to take some accountability on their participation in this part of crack. And I hope that a lot of these males that did take this transaction, I hope that they've reconciled with these Black women and try to like heal some of the things that happened with them, and that they've been remorseful for that, right? Because I think that, yeah, we can talk about all the other stuff and we will get to that, but I think that they do have to take some responsibility in their role in that particular part. Now we can talk about, you know, Black women using their bodies and as a means to make money, right? That's a totally different conversation. But this in particular was really hard because we know that, you know, these women were doing it to feed an addiction. And so, like I said, you know, this part of the documentary was probably the best part for me, because it helped me to realize, and, you know, somebody who does work in the rehabilitation field and has a degree in it, it helped me once again realize just the sickness that is crack, and how it can, you know, divide a community, divide a family. So Just Say No Reagan basically talks about how crack entered into our communities, right? Through the Reagan administration. So I'm not going to talk in great deal about it. You can definitely watch the documentary for more information. But basically, Reagan is hung up on helping Central America, right? He's so hung up on helping Central America that he brings this to Congress, right? He brings this to the government in order to receive funding so that he can help Central America. So basically, the reason why crack is such a problem in our neighborhood is because Reagan has allowed Central America to drop off drugs in our community. We become the casualties of this sort of sainthood that Reagan decides that he wants to be. You know, and one of the things that I find so very, very fascinating about, you know, conversations about presidents is that, you know, people are ranking Trump as the worst president in U.S. history. And I'm wondering, did y'all forget about Reagan? You know, did y'all forget about the harm that Reagan did to the Black community? And, you know, so as, you know, the documentary progresses into Just Say No Reagan, you know, they begin to see the real effects of crack in the Black community, right? They begin to just see, you know, how it's affected, you know, those who are in poverty, right? And so you have Nancy Reagan, who decides that she is going to become the spokesperson for the Just Say No campaign, right? So you see Nancy Reagan talking about, you know, somebody asked me the other day what I would do if I was offered drugs, and I would just say no. You know, that was what she came up with. And it's so funny, you know, I'm having an issue with white women and this whole sainthood that they consider themselves to be in, right? You know, when really they are just as destructive as their counterparts. One of the things about Nancy Reagan that is so funny to me and a lot of white women in general, a lot of white women in power is, you know, they don't have relationships with Black people outside of, you know, this economic workforce relationship, right? So we can pretty much say that Nancy didn't have, you know, 50 million friends in the Black community. She just didn't. You know what I'm saying? So she's looking at the only way that she knows Black people to begin with, or what's going on with Black people at all, is through, you know, those that work for her and around her. And it's so funny that a person with no real background in rehabilitation, no background in economic hardships, no background in the judicial system, to then, you know, take on this Just Say No campaign. So we have, you know, athletes coming out with, you know, commercials and music. You know, we have actors just say no, this is your brain on drugs. You know, we see a lot of that start to come about as Nancy becomes the forefront of the Just Say No campaign, even though her husband is the reason why, you know, these drugs have ended up in our community. So chapter 6 is Media Frenzy, and this is the end of the documentary, and also one of my favorite chapters of the documentary. So this is where they start to talk about, you know, the media's role in the depiction of crack in the Black community, right? So one of the things that they talk about is Len Bias, right? Len Bias was a prominent basketball player set to play for the Boston Celtics. He went to party because, you know, he had just, you know, heard that he would be on the team that he desired to be on. He does a little bit of crack, and then I guess he has a seizure or a bad reaction and ultimately dies, right? And so, you know, the media takes control of this story of Len Bias, right? And basically is going around saying, hey, he died from crack, you know, and it was his first time ever using it, you know, even though no one knows if that's true or not. You know, this has become the story. This has become the narrative that crack has such a huge impact that you could die from it in just one setting, right? So then you have Jesse Jackson Jr., who at Len Bias's funeral basically comes out and says that dope has killed more people than the rope of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, he doesn't have any education, any resources, any research at this moment that would ever tell him that that was the case, you know, but here he is opening his mouth. And from that, it creates what they call in chapter 6, a media frenzy. Then, you know, everybody's trying to get a hold of, you know, this crack epidemic. There were two things that stuck out to me in the media frenzy part of the documentary. One of them was the discussion of crack babies, right? And so we see a rise in the talk of crack babies in the media because of a doctor by the name of Ira Shasnoff. Ira Shasnoff is actually here in Chicago. And from what I hear, he's still, you know, practicing. But one of the things that he writes is an article called Cocaine Use in Pregnancy. And basically what he says is that if a child is born to a mother who was on crack or cocaine, that this child would be very colicky, angry. The milestones of this child will be minimal, late, and that, you know, years from now, this child would basically be a problem. And we see that depicted in roles like Losing Isaiah. You know, I remember watching Losing Isaiah, and, you know, when the little girl picks up the baby and the lady's like, don't look in his eyes, you know what I'm saying? I remember thinking like all crack babies were evil, basically because the media was feeding me this information, right? And it came from a doctor by the name of Ira Shasnoff, right? And so he's going around with this article, Cocaine Use in Pregnancy. And what we find out through this documentary is that, you know, only 2 to 3% were discovered to have cocaine in their system when they gave birth. and that Ira Shaznov had not done a wide range of research on this, right? He had only done research on 23 women. So he didn't even do enough research to conclude this information. So there was information like 100,000 babies were born as crack babies, which was so very, very false, which was not true, but it was going through the media that, the number of crack babies were producing at such a high rate that it was going to be trouble for us in 5 to 10 years, right? And then through this part of the documentary, you hear about a story about Jennifer Johnson. And basically, she, in confidence told her physician that she had been dealing with so much that she had began to use in order to cope. And so she thought that that was, something that she could do in order to receive help. She thought that she could confide in this doctor, but really what ended up happening is this doctor ended up reaching out to a police officer, and Jennifer Johnson subsequently was arrested, and she was charged with child abuse and drug abuse to a minor, with no evidence. No one had any research on whether or not drugs could directly go from the umbilical cord to the baby and the baby be addicted, but they used Jennifer Johnson, and subsequently arrested her for this bad research and bad information that was going out into the media. Another part that really pissed me off, and I don't really want to threaten nobody. But Shirley Brown, there is a place for you in hell for the shit that you did. And if you've watched this documentary, you know who Shirley Brown is. Shirley Brown is a nurse at the Medical University of South Carolina in the late 80s and 90s. Basically, she starts to give her pregnant women drug tests. And if their drug test came back positive, she would give that to the police, and the police would take their babies right after they were delivered. That was just shocking to hear. And I mean, one of the things that, quotes that someone said in this movie that stuck out to me is the way you can criminalize Black women is by saying she is harming children. And it was evident that the narrative during this time was that Black women were incapable of raising their children, were incapable of coping, right? And so they vilified the Black woman during this time. And, unfortunately, we see that in, movies like Boys in the Hood. We see that in, movies like New York, New Jack City, where, even in Jungle Fever, we see, Vivian saying she's going to suck somebody's, D-I-C-K, all of these, I'll suck your blah, 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 and unfortunately, and I love all of these directors, I really, really do, but unfortunately, even they fell victim to the narrative that the Black woman was careless, and irresponsible because of her addiction to drugs. And, it produced in us a dislike of these women. Like I said before, we shun these women from our families, and it's tragic. Last but certainly not least, we talk about how the crime bill was introduced, right? So we have Tip O'Neill, who's the Speaker of the House, who decides to tell, the House of Representatives that they are going to have to come up with some type of plan to get drugs off the street, especially during this time because election was coming up and they wanted to make sure that it was clear that they were tough on crime, right? And so because, there was such a high addiction rate supposedly going on and the community asking for some type of resolve, this is when the government is now pressured to step in, right? And so Tip O'Neill says, hey, you got to come up with a bill. You got to come up with something in order to get these bad people off the street. And so they come up with the 1994 crime bill, which is underneath the Clinton administration. And we know that Clinton came in with this tough approach that he got from Bush. You know, Bush, you know, he was dealt with in this as well. And his idea of being tough on crime and militarizing the police to, you know, break into our homes, to arrest our men and women who are addicted to drugs or selling drugs. So we see that happen through Bush. And then, of course, Clinton comes in and he's going to be just as tough, right? You know, even his announcement into the political race was behind, you know, men and women in prison, right? You know, there's this picture of him and then all of the people from prison in the back of him. So he comes in with this, you know, mindset that he's going to not play games with our community, right? And so they come up with the 1994 crime bill that ultimately puts everybody in the Black community in jail, whether you sold it, whether you were addicted to it. You know, unfortunately, you were ultimately stripped away from your home, you know, for a number of years. And so we see people that, you know, serve these crimes 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years. You know, they get these sentences, whereas cocaine, you know, sentence was light, you know, and cocaine basically was only seen in the white community. And they basically talk about how the government really assumed that they were doing their job in making crack, you know, a tougher punishment without any research, without any data. You know, they get this done in 4 weeks, which is unheard of, you know, which is a mess, right? And so they discussed that. And then they also discuss in LA, you know, how LA found out that the CIA had a lot to do with drugs coming into the community. And unfortunately, you know, the CIA downplaying it and saying that they really didn't have anything to do with it. And so you see, you know, that community really come together and start to tell the story of how much, you know, crack has affected the community and how, you know, people are in prison now because of it. And families have been divided and broken up. And ultimately, it's their fault, you know. And so that's a part of the documentary as well. One thing that stood out to me, and I'm going to end it here. One thing that stood out to me about this documentary is just how remorseful we were as Black people, or repentance we had for allowing crack into our families, allowing crack into our communities, selling it, distributing it, making money from it. You know, how remorseful we were for our part in our destruction. And it's sad that we have way more remorse for it, even though we didn't bring it in. And it's sad that we have never been fixed financially and also given an apology for the fact that there is no way this would have entered our community without the help of the government and without the government playing a blind eye. And so this was a really, really good documentary. I do hope that you watch this more than once. I really hope that this is shown in schools and colleges and that a discussion happens from it. Stanley Nelson Jr. did an awesome job, as he has done previously on other documentaries. And so I implore you to watch this, to share this. And thank you so much for tuning in. I'll definitely be back next week for another review or commentary. You enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.